It's great to be here with you, Bobby.
And Chris, I know you've told me bits and pieces of stories, things that have happened in your life, and I want you to share them with the people out there, if you don't mind.
No,
because you've been through a lot. I mean, a lot. And just kind of start out from the beginning. I know you were born and raised in California.
Yes,
and,
sir.
You were singing with your family, very talented
sir.
family. Was it the Goff family? That's
Singing Goff family.
Singing Goff family.
Yes, sir.
No relation to Jerry Goff, huh?
Third cousin.
Super. Just had to throw that in. Anyway, just kind of start from the beginning, man, and just let her go. I'm anxious to hear this. And I know this will be inspiring to a lot of people out there.
Man, we were raised on the bus, bus life. And I was raised on the bus since we started out in a Titan motorhome. I was 3 years old, 3 years old when we hit the road full time. And we had signed with Calvary Records, and they had moved us back to Nashville whenever they'd moved back here, and they had wanted us to move back here. And it was our second week, I believe, we were here. And we were living in our bus at Two Rivers Campground over on Briley Parkway, right next to the KOA over there. And we were there, and Dad came into the bus one day, and this is, like I said, our second week here, and Dad goes, called all the family together, and he goes, "Guess what we're singing this Friday night?" And we said, "Where?" And he goes, "The Grand Ole Opry." And we were like, "Whatever." Yeah, whatever. And didn't believe what he thought he was just pulling our leg. Dad had a way of doing that. And he goes, "I'm telling you, we're singing at the Opry this Friday night." And we, in fact, sang at the Grand Ole Gospel Hour with Jimmy Snow.
Yeah.
And we did that many times until I was 18 years old. But anyway, that was
like midnight, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Like 11:30 midnight. Yeah, it was the Grand Ole Gospel Hour.
Yeah.
And after the last Opry show, and Jimmy would have his show there, and it was quite cool. And Jimmy became our pastor for a long time. Him and Dad were really good friends. And but that's where we started in Nashville, and we came out here, and I was raised on the bus, and I was homeschooled from first grade until I graduated, and I'd never been to public school. Yeah. And so it was an interesting life growing up, and I think probably looking back these days, and I was just talking to my wife about it, how much it probably shaped me and made me ready for a lot of things that happened later on in life. Because, when you're on the road and you're sitting broke down the side of the road in front of a barbecue place. And this is a true story. We never broke down in front of a barbecue place. It was out in the middle of nowhere and we broke down. I think it was in Alabama. But we're in the middle of Alabama, in the middle of the sticks, and our clutch went out on our bus, and we were out in the middle of, but right in front of this barbecue place, and we had no money, and you could smell the barbecue, and we were stinking hungry, man, and we wanted some food. But the way that we used to trust, because Dad never set a price on going to minister to church. He always says, we'll come for free will offering. And so we were going from place to place and just trust that God was going to take care of us. And that taught me a lot. Yeah. That taught me a lot. Because God always did. God always came through. That's exactly how my family does now. We've been doing it for our 14th year. We never charge the church. We just go on love offerings, and God provides. He does. And it's amazing. It is. And I have so much respect looking back at my dad, because there was a lot of groups and a lot of them had overheads, and I get it, and they had things that they had to do to keep, because it was a ministry, but it was their business as well. And they had to keep it going. But I had a lot of respect for my dad, because he didn't care if it was 50 people or, there'd be one night we'd be singing for 50 people in a church. The next night we'd be in an auditorium with the Goodmans and the Hensons and everybody. In fact, y'all, at Boutwell Auditorium out in Birmingham. I remember that when I was a kid. Yeah. And, you just never know where you're going to be the next day. Right. That's true. But I hear your dad kept y'all pretty busy. What your older sister talks about, and Sonia? I have one of the old date books at the house, and me and Sherry were looking through it, and we had sang 338 dates one year.
Oh,
and
my goodness.
we would do revivals. We'd go to
Yeah.
churches, and we'd do sometimes Sunday through Wednesday, Wednesday
Yeah.
through Sunday. You know how it goes, Sunday through Sunday, and then we'd hit little things going through, and we'd hit homecomings, sing at homecomings and different events. And there'd be times we'd sing 3 times on a Sunday on morning, and then have a homecoming afternoon, and then have a night
Yeah.
service. You know, and but yeah, Dad kept us very busy, very busy.
He was a pretty good booking agent. I need him right now. But I wish he was around. I don't want to sing that much, but
It was something else.
Yeah.
But Dad was a preacher too, so he used to always say, "Dog barks, dog barks, a singer sings, and a preacher preaches."
Yeah.
And Dad never got, he never lost that preacher, and
Yeah.
so he loved to do revivals at churches.
that's cool.
And it was a very interesting way to grow up, because you go into a church and you're there for a couple days, and you get to know people, and then
Yeah.
you're gone, and then you go to the next church and do the same thing over, and
Yeah.
it just happens just continually. You know how it goes. It's
Mhm.
and it's an interesting life, and interesting way to grow up.
Yeah, pretty cool. So, how long did you sing with your family? I mean, how long did that happen?
Well,
That
we
go?
were 1986, and we were out in Ridgecrest, California, and it was October, and that following December I was going to turn 18. And a few years earlier, my brothers and sisters abandoned me on the road with Mom and Dad, and it was just me, Mom and Dad, and I was just so used to everybody being around. It was just like a big drastic change.
Yeah.
And but we were at a revival there in Ridgecrest, and we were singing, and there were some good friends of ours that were ministers there, the youth ministers there, and they were just became such an instrumental part of my life. I love them, and my buddy Dave just passed away, and David Mast, and but we were singing at the church, and I was looking over at them, and when you're singing, you'll see your friends out there, you kind of smile and stuff. But I noticed sitting next to his wife Loretta was this little blonde-haired girl, and every time I look over at Loretta, she'd look at me and she'd get this big smile on her face, and so next thing you know, we're smiling at each other, and I'm like, "Who's Dave and Loretta?" And so, but I was this shy kid, and I didn't have a lot of I was shy, and so. But they had the Harvest Festival coming up there that they had for Halloween, and they had a hay ride and everything with the church, and they had that coming up. And Loretta said, "Hey, would you like to go with Lisa to that hay ride on that hay ride?" And I said, "That'd be awesome."
Yeah.
So she went to Lisa and she asked her. Next thing you know, me and Lisa are talking and become my girlfriend, and we started talking, and we went on that hay ride. We got on that hay ride, and we started joking, and it started off as a joke at the beginning, and we were on the hay ride, and she goes, "Wouldn't it be crazy if we got married?"
Wow.
And I said, "That would be something else." And she goes, "And we had kids?" And she goes, "What would we name our first kid?" I said, "I don't know
The
what
first
would-"
date?
The first date. We were on the hay ride, and she goes, "I've always liked the name Heath." And I said, "Heath?" And she goes, "Yeah." And she goes, "I got it off the Big Valley. I always liked the
Yeah.
Big Valley."
Oh, yeah.
Heath Barkley.
Yeah.
And
$6
and
million man.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I said, "So Heath," and I said, "I love that name." And next thing you know, we come back from the hayride, and we're engaged that night, and we've named our first child. And
That was quick, man.
it was crazy. It was on our first date we got engaged. And after that, I told my dad about it, and my dad said, "You've lost your mind." And my sisters, Cindy and Sonia, Dad used to always have the thought process of, and he was a pastor for 25 years when we quit the road, but he always had the thought process of, if I can talk you out of getting married, you don't need to be married. And Dad would do everything he could to try to discourage me. And he said, "I'll tell you what, if you all just wait a year. And he said, "And I'll give my blessing." And I said, "That's okay, Dad, we'll do that."
Oh.
So we waited a year, but the thing is, I had moved to Sunnyvale, where Dad took a church, because Dad said, "If you get married, we're quitting the road. We're not taking anyone else on the road. I'm done with that."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, then I guess we're quitting the road." And he called my bluff. He didn't think I'd do it because I love the road.
Oh.
And next thing I know, he's putting his name in for a church out in Sunnyvale, California, out in the San Francisco Bay Area by San Jose.
Uh-huh.
And next thing I know, Dad gets voted into the church. And what's crazy about this is the year before Dad took this church, and the year, and this was 1987 that he finally took the church. 1986, whenever I had met Lisa in October, the January before, we had been at that church. And at that church, there was an assistant pastor at the church at the time. His name was Jeff Windsor, and Jeff and his wife Brenda had a niece who had come down there. And this will go into the story here as we go along. But I met this girl named Sherry, and I was 17 and she was 15, and it was just 6-7 months before I met Lisa. Uh-huh. And me and Sherry, Jeff's wife Brenda said, "Hey, would you want to go to?" We're there having a revival, and she said, "Why don't we go out to lunch one day and you can meet Sherry and stuff?" So we went to lunch that day, and I met Sherry, and she was just a knockout. She was a beautiful girl. Just thought that she was just it. And next thing you know, we're just crazy about each other.
Yeah.
And after that had happened, we had went back to Nashville after that tour. After coming out to California for that tour, and while I was in California, her best friend and best friend's brother and dad came out to Nashville to see us because they were friends of ours as well. Mm-hmm. And me and Bo Henson ended up going with her best friend and her best friend's brother to Family Fun Land over in Goodlettsville. Yeah, we used to go over there and play video games and stuff when we were kids, and I ended up kissing her best friend. Oh. And she called her, and she called my dad. Sherry called my dad. She was 15. She said, "You tell your son to never call me again." Mm. And we didn't talk for 22 years. But anyway, me and Lisa got married, and when we got married, we had I had just turned 19, and she had just turned 18, and it was quite interesting because we didn't even know each other, But after a year, when I moved down to San Jose for about 6 months, there was some people in Dad's church who know how much I loved Lisa and wanted her around and couldn't stand being away from her. And so after I'd moved out there, they had offered for Lisa to come out there and live in their house and their home and help take care of their home and be out there where I was. And my dad said that wasn't the deal. And I said, "Dad, you didn't say anything about where she had to live or anything else. You just said if we waited a year." Yeah. And he couldn't argue with that because he knew I was right. Yeah. But we ended up getting married, and it was 11 months later after we got married, we found out that she was pregnant with a baby. And when she was pregnant with the baby, we had found out that there were some medical issues that she had that she didn't know about, and it was called a bicarnial uterus. And there was a wall down the middle of the uterus, and so there was not room really, and little did we know, for a baby to really develop. Oh. And that's where we still have no answers for everything that happened. But anyway, the doctor had told us she was pregnant, and he said her due date for a certain date, and he was, we're going to call it a week after that, and we're going to go ahead, and she don't have it by here, we're going to try to induce her. Yeah. And his nurse said, "No, you're on vacation that week." And he said, "Okay, well, we're going to move it out. Well, I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks, so we're going to move it out." And they moved it out to where she was going to could have been overdue. Yeah. But the same doctor had a woman patient who was in my dad's church, and she had gotten pregnant. He said there's a sac there, but there's no baby. We have to do a DNC and get rid of everything. And so they did it, came back, and the same thing again, said there's just a sac, there's no baby. And my dad said, "You need to go get a second opinion." She went and got a second opinion, and he said, "Oh, there's the baby. I can't believe I missed that." And so this doctor, I questioned, but we were already going down the road with this. I had found this out during the process of everything toward the end of the process. Yeah. But Lisa went in, and so we knew that, and the doctor found it very interesting that she had the bicarnial uterus and everything, and he was saying stuff like, I wonder if she can give birth. I wonder if she can give birth naturally. He was, I want to try that. I want to see if we can do that. Mm-hmm. And he was almost like it was making an experiment out of it. Yeah. And so we got to the hospital, and and she had her water broken. We went in, but she would not dilate. She wouldn't get to where she needed to. He put her on Pitocin for a long time, and still with his bicornular uterus. And later on, we found out she could have never given birth naturally. And but when they broke the water in the hospital, her water broke, and there was this dark substance in the water. And he goes, oh, and I said, what's that? And the doctor said, that's a meconium. That's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
And I kind of looked at him like the RCA dog, nothing to worry about. I don't, it's a dark substance. I didn't get it. I got on the phone and I'd stepped out and I called a friend of mine, and she was in the medical field. And she said, Chris, that's a meconium. You go in there and you tell them to get that baby out of her right now. Yeah. That means that the baby is under stress.
Right.
And the baby what happens is the baby goes to the bathroom, and it's a tar-like substance, and they get under stress, they breathe.
That's right.
And they take in a breath, and it gets in their lungs.
Man, this stuff sounds so familiar to me because we went through almost the same thing.
Did you really?
With Grace, our oldest.
Yeah.
The same kind of situation that the doctor wanted to get her out of there because, my wife was supposedly 2 weeks overdue. That's why he wanted to induce, which we found out she wasn't 2 weeks overdue. And if he hadn't have induced, she may not have cerebral palsy today,
Wow.
But anyway, it's not my story, it's your story.
No, that's something
but it
else.
does, when you say Pitocin and stuff like that, it brings back memories that, kind of some bad memories, but.
Well, and I'm right here talking about this.
Yeah.
Right, I'm getting chills and stuff just because knowing knowing that we have that in common with all that there, and Grace and I just want to stop real quick and just tell you that, and I mean this, and I've loved your music forever, and I've loved you forever as far as your music and stuff. But man, you've become one of my heroes, and me and Sherry just love you and Becky, and just watch the parents that you are. And the way that you just love and take care of Grace and your other kids. You've got amazing family. Amazing.
I appreciate it, man. We feel the same way about y'all especially after what we've seen with Blake, and you're going to get to that.
Yes.
And so, man, I appreciate that. That's awesome.
But the water broke, and the APGAR scores were great, and they were 8 and 9, and they were really good APGAR scores, and we thought everything was great. He was 8 pounds, 9 ounces, I believe. He was a big boy.
Yeah.
And they were working on him and stuff, and as he would start to cry and stuff, you'd hear, ah, ah, and the doctors would hear that noise, and they said he's struggling to breathe. He's having a hard time breathing. And after a bit, they found out that the meconium, they had done the suction stuff, that he had swallowed the meconium, and they made the decision that he needed to go. This was in Mountain View, California, and they made the decision that he needed to go to Oakland, California, to Oakland Children's Hospital. Mm-hmm. And they had a brand new machine that just went there, and our baby was the first one on it there at Oakland. It was called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And what that machine does is the baby is clinically dead. They stop the heart, and then they put, it's almost like a dialysis machine. They have a pump, and there's a tube that goes into the neck, and then there's a tube that goes into the chest, and it pumps the blood through the body. And then they have machine ventilator keeping the lungs going. But as that's going on, you always have to worry about it, because with that ventilator going on, after a while, the baby's lungs get stiff, and it'll blow out a hole into the lung, what's called a pneumothorax. Yeah. And so every time that, you never know, because you'd have ups and downs. And that's what I've come to realize with all this, because right now I'm writing this book, and it's such an emotional roller coaster that and I know when you're going through this stuff, things are great, things are bad, things are great, things are bad. Hey, great news, bad news, and it was just, and it's tough. And but we went to Oakland. They put him on the machine, and he ran a course there. I think he was on the machine for somewhere around 17, 18 days. And they finally got to the point, and what would they have to do is they have to do blood transfusions through all this, because the blood has to recirculating in. They have to put the nutrients back in it and get the all the stuff that's in the blood, the hemoglobin and all that stuff back in there, and the plasma, and keep it fresh. So Every time they do that, though, we're running a risk of him catching a disease called cytomegalovirus, CMV. And so anyway, he had ran his course on ECMO, and they said that they had to take him off of it, and they took him. And they said, we're going to send him to Stanford Medical. They've got a new ventilator because he kept breathing, and he'd have that pneumothorax. He'd blow the hole in his lung, and he'd have setbacks, and we'd move forward, and then you'd have setbacks with the pneumo. Well, they finally said, ECMO, he's ran his course here, but there's another machine that's an experimental machine, and it's at Stanford University and Stanford Medical, and it's called, it's a jet ventilator. And what it does is it pumps 250 breaths. Well, it can pump up to 700 breaths a minute into the baby's lungs, and it's just very small breath.
Yeah.
And that way it's not expanding the lungs so much to where it's blowing holes in the lungs and blowing the pneumothorax. And they said maybe if he had stopped having those pneumos, then maybe he could recover. So they got him there, and they got him on that machine. And we went through just so many days, and you had seen, they talked about a heart transplant, but he'd have to have a heart-lung transplant to do that. And they were looking into that. And then all at once they came back and they said they came back to us and they checked into it, and they said he's not going to be a candidate for a heart lung transplant because he would not make it through the surgery. And the baby in his that was on the next nursery over actually got the heart that had come in. And we were so happy for the family because it saved their baby's life. But we were there, and it finally came to the point that they said we need to run some testing because they had noticed that they had not seen any movement, and they did a scan on his brain, and they said that he was brain dead. And so they said that they were going to have to take him off the machine, and my sister Cindy was there, and my brother Kevin and his wife, then a bunch of our family was there, and they took him off the machine, and it was the first time we got to hold our son. And with no wires or anything. And so we just passed him around the room, and from person to person, let him hold him and talk to him. And I got to hold him and talk to him. And then my sister Cindy was holding him and talking to him. Then all at once, he took his final breath, and this little smile came across his face. And the doctor that was there started freaking out. He goes, hey, wait, that's not possible. He's brain dead. Your brain has to tell your face. He goes, the muscles. And so he didn't understand that, but we did. And we knew that he was stepping into the presence of the King. He was crossing over, and had no doubt. And so that was one of the hardest things I ever did, was to stand by the casket, by the graveside of my son, 2 months old. And here I was, 21 years old, and I was singing. I just started trying to do Christian rock music, and I had long hair.
I've seen the pictures.
Earrings, and had a band. But anyway, and again, it just everything going crazy, and me and my friends would meet out in the church for me to stay sane, and we'd play music out there. That's kind of how we started doing that. But anyway, so Heath had died, and just a day short of his second month birthday. And then it was just, goodness, a year later, not even a year later, Lisa found out she was pregnant again. And that was with our son, Blake. And Blake was taken into the hospital. And Blake, they had made the decision to go ahead and take him and do cesarean and do it 4 weeks early so the baby wouldn't get under stress. And so everything went great. We got him to the hospital, no signs of stress. Everything was awesome. Everything was great. They got there. They went in and they did the cesarean, and they came out, and I looked at my son, and I got to hold my son. It was amazing. And I'm like, wow, and it's just the joy of a parent.
Oh, sure.
And then they put him under the lamps, and they're sitting there working on him and getting him cleaned up and everything. And it was a joy. And then little time goes by, and a little bit more time goes by, and they're over looking at him more, and they're looking at him more. And then all at once, there's other people coming over and looking at him. They're bringing machines in. And next thing we know, he's having problems breathing.
Oh, man.
And this is where we met a doctor named Dr. Heller. And Dr. Heller was a pretty amazing man, and I'll get into Dr. Heller's story here in a second. But Blake went in and he was on machines, and they had him. Well, they just had him on oxygen, and then they put him in the incubator to where it would keep him warm and keep noise out, and they could flow oxygen into that little box where he was. And then Blake got more sick and more sick and more sick. And we were there, I think it was 10 days in, and me and Sherry, I have a problem with doing that. I call Lisa Sherry and Sherry Lisa. But me and Lisa were standing there, my sister Cindy, and just talking to the baby and talking to Blake, and all at once, machine started going crazy, and people started running over there, and we're like, "What's going on?" And they're like, "Step back, step back." We stepped back, and the nurse said, "Go get Dr. Heller right now." They ran and they got Dr. Heller. Dr. Heller ran in there, and all at once, the machines were making all the noise, dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
Then all at once you hear, "Bah!"
Oh, no.
And Blake had died. And then we're standing here, and they took the shockers and they hit him on the chest, and the baby Blake came up off that bed about that much.
Wow.
Probably 6-8 inches. And Dr. Heller said, they said, "Are we going to stop? Are we going to stop?" He goes, "No, I'm not giving up on this baby." And Cindy grabbed us by the arm and said, "Come on, you don't need to see this." And she got us out of the room, and Lisa started crying. She said, "I want him to be in there alone with no one." And Cindy said, "I'll go back in there." Cindy has this way. Cindy is the most cool, calm, and collected person I've ever seen in my life, who can be in the most tense, crazy situation and just keep a straight
level head.
And get past everything that's going on. She don't get affected by like the baby being coated with the shockers,
freaking out
with the
like a lot of
pads.
people do.
She'll stand there and watch. And so she came back out and said they had to use the pads again. And but she said they got the baby's heartbeat back. And so a couple days went by, and Dr. Heller called us in, and they said, well, since Blake had his episode, he was dead for about 7.5 minutes. And we're running some tests on him and checking his brain activity and doing some scans of the brain to see what kind of damage may have been done, because this can cause brain damage being dead that long, not breathing, oxygen being cut off. And he said Blake has stopped moving his right side. He had went deaf and he had went blind. And they said, this is where we're at. He's going to be blind, he's going to be deaf, and he's going to be paralyzed. And my dad said, well, we're going to pray. Dr. Heller looked at me and said, you do whatever you want to do. You can do whatever you want to do. It's going to take some medical knowledge. I looked at my dad, and Dad looked at me. And so the day went on. My dad called me aside a little bit later. He said, son, I wanted to tell you. He said, I just talked to Dr. Heller. We just had a long conversation. And he said, and I found out Dr. Heller is an atheist. And he said he has no need for this God talk. And I said, well, Dad, I want to change doctors. I said, because I don't want anyone touching our son that doesn't have faith to believe this. And my dad said, son, leave it alone. He said, there's reasons for everything. Leave it alone. I feel we just need to leave it alone. And so I left it alone because my dad was a very wise man. And so a week went by, and Dr. Heller called us together again and said, got some bad news. We've run some blood cultures on Blake. And what I didn't say before is Heath, eventually when he died, they had found out that from the blood transfusions that he had developed CMV in his blood. And it's a gene that gets into the blood that's deadly to babies under 6 months old, 6 months and under. Most adults carry it, and it can cause flu, and it can cause things like that. But it eventually attacks all the major organs of the baby. And that's what eventually took Heath's life, was that. He couldn't fight it. So Dr. Heller called us together, and he said, I'm afraid that we've ran cultures on Blake, and he has CMV in his blood. And there's nothing we can do. We've lost this fight. There's nothing we can do. My dad said, he said, well, we're going to pray. That was my dad's natural response. He wasn't trying to say that to Dr. Heller to offend him, but he looks at the family. He says, well, we're going to pray. Dr. Heller looked, and he goes, okay. And he rolled his eyes. And So Dad comes back a week later. We came to the hospital. Excuse me, 3 days later, we came back to the hospital. And Dr. Heller was looking through you could see there was a window to where you could see into the nursery, into the hallway. And Dr. Heller looked out and he saw us and he started acting all crazy. And we're like, what's going on? And Dr. Heller, we walked into this little room where you wash up before you go into the nursery. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Heller stuck his head out there. He goes, you guys get in here. You got to see this. Come here. Look, come here. You got to see this. We washed up and we walked in there, and Blake's moving his arms and kicking his legs and looking around. And Lisa said something, and he turned his head over to see where his mama was. Yeah. Even his baby knows his mama's voice. Yeah. And when she talked, he moved over to try to see her. Uh-huh. And that Dr. Heller said, isn't that something else? And my dad said, praise God. Uh-huh. And Dr. Heller kind of chuckled, Yeah. And so anyway, then after that, Dr. Heller had told us that he had tested positive for CMV and there's nothing they could do. Dad said, well, we're going to pray. We came back to the hospital a week later, and Dad said, Dr. Heller, he said, I'd like you to run that blood test again. He said, Reverend Goff, he said, Kaiser Insurance won't cover it. It's too accurate of a test. And it's too accurate of a test, and we've got our answer. And Dad said, I'll tell you what, if it's the same results, I'll pay for it out of my own pocket. He said, will that work? He said, let me check. And he checked, and they said that would be fine. They ran it again, and it was gone. And awesome. Dr. Heller, his mouth just kind of dropped open that time, and he didn't know what to say. Yeah. And so then they found out that Blake had an incurable heart disease called cardiomyopathy. And the muscle of the heart was 4 times thicker than the normal heart. So blood would have trouble pumping through the walls, through the ventricles. And it would, they said eventually he would go to sleep and not wake up. And they said we'd probably walk into his room one morning and find him gone. Yeah. And actually they said that he wouldn't live past 9 months old is what they first told us. And it came to 9 months. But we had taken Blake home, and it was 5 or 6 months in, and we looked, and Blake's head was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I've got pictures of it, and he looked like, he looked like an alien, what you would think an alien would look like. Yeah. And his head was just so big, and we took him in to find out that he had hydrocephalus, to where he had a grade 4 brain hemorrhage, and he began to develop fluids on his brain. And so they had to go in and they had to place a shunt in his head. And when they did that, his head started coming down and all that. Yeah. But we went through all this process, and then it was about a year again later, my wife finds out she's pregnant again. And this is our daughter, Chelsea. And again, they had it to where she was going to deliver sooner. And that was the thing with Blake. There was never any stress. There was never anything. And what the doctor told us, it was a fluke. It was just a fluke that our second baby, the first baby, they tried to put it off as, the meconium was just too much, and all this. Yeah. Then they said the second one's a fluke. Blake, we don't know what to say. But there was just so many unanswered questions. Yeah. And then when Chelsea was born, she came into the hospital. She's born, and they bring us out, and they said it's a girl. And we had this thought in our head, and I remember me and Lisa talking about it. Maybe it's just girls. Maybe we're having problems with boys, because we've seen people who that has happened on talk shows and different things. Yeah. And Chelsea was born and had a beautiful baby girl, and she was just perfect. And but they brought her out, and I got to hold her, and they almost lost Lisa during the process of her giving birth. Oh, goodness. And her blood pressure went way low, and her heart rate went down, and they didn't know what the answer to why that had happened. But anyway, we're watching through the window, and we're watching them work on, take care of Chelsea and stuff. And in fact, there's some people in our church here, Dave and Trish. They moved here from Texas, and they were there with us. And they were watching through the window, and Trish goes, "Man, what's all these people starting to come into this room?" And I walked over there, and next thing I know, there's people walking into the room, and didn't know what was going on, but there's just a baby. So I walked over, and they had finally got Lisa settled in her room. I walked over to see her, talk to her for a few, and then I walked back over, and they stayed there by the window. Dave and Trish stayed by the window to tell me what was going on. They said, "We've seen people come in and out of the room. We've seen x-ray machines come in and out." And started wondering what was going on. Dr. Heller's in there listening with a stethoscope to her chest. All at once, there's another pediatrician that's coming in there, and you're seeing specialists, and
It's like a deja vu
Man.
all over again.
it really is. And you're
Yeah.
sitting here, and I'm like, what is next? What is
Yeah.
this? There's no way. This
Yeah.
is not happening.
Yeah.
And so it was a couple days, and they talked about, they watched her, and all at once they said before, and she had begun to get sick like Blake did. She couldn't breathe. She was not oxygenating. And the saturations were low, and they said, Chris, before she gets too bad, from the history of things that we've seen with your kids, we want to go ahead and send her to Oakland Children's Hospital. We want to get her on ECMO. And because that would give her heart time to rest and her lungs time to rest to where she could rejuvenate. And so we get back to Oakland Children's Hospital, and the doctors and all the staff, they look at us. They just look at us with their mouths open, and they just grab us and hug us. And we developed such good relationships with the doctors and the staff.
Yeah.
We were there, and again, here we are going through, they're drawing all the blood gases, and they're having to do blood transfusions, and Chelsea's on ECMO, and every time they would do blood transfusions, we would just wait to hear if there was any CMV in the blood, and all these things start going back in your head, and the enemy starts throwing a lot of things, and just saying, and you start saying, God, where are you?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
What's the deal?
Sure.
What's the purpose?
It's just natural to wonder.
It is.
What's going on? I mean, what did I do to deserve this?
It really is. And so you sit there and you just say, we just kind of shook our head, and here we are, still kids. We're 22, 23 years old.
Sure.
And by then, I guess I was 23, almost 24. But anyway, Chelsea's at Oakland Children's for, I believe she ran on ECMO for 21 days. And that's they don't like to go that long on ECMO.
Yeah.
And finally, one night, I walked into the hospital room, and my dad was standing there. My dad was crying. I said, Dad, what's going on? He said, Chris, he said, God told me to lay my hand down on this baby's chest firmly and to claim healing. And he said, and I said, God, these nurses are going to think I'm crazy with these tubes with blood going into her body and all these tubes and things on this baby. They'll think I'm crazy. God said, you do what I told you to do.
Yeah.
And he said, and Chris, I did it. He said, I did it. And he said, and I've never told you this with any of your kids. He said, but she's healed. She's going home. And I said, Dad, that's awesome. He goes, no, son, you don't understand. He said, she's going home. He said, if it don't happen, he said, I'll never bother you about reading your Bible. He said, I'll never bother you about going to church. I'll never bother you about your prayer life. I'll never bother you about anything. And I said, Dad, and he said, son, no. He said, listen, I'll go one step further. He said, if it don't happen, he said, you can say your dad serves a false God. You can say that your dad brought you up with a false God and bad beliefs.
Wow.
That's how sure I am of what I heard. And I said, Dad, that's incredible. Right after he says this, we walk out of the room, and there was about 8 doctors standing in the hallway. And they said, we need to talk to the family right away. Can you get the family together? We went and got the family, came back, and they took us into a conference room. And they said, we're watching Chelsea, Dr. Powers, in fact. And it's funny, it's my stepdad's last name.
Yeah.
But Dr. Powers, he said, we're watching Chelsea go through all the same things that we watched Heath go through. And they said, she's ran her course on ECMO. There's nothing. I said, what about the jet ventilator? He said, that's a whole different set of circumstances. We're not having problems with the pneumos, none of that. He said, this is the final straw. And he said, you guys need to make preparations and make plans because we're taking her off this machine tonight. And she's not going to make it. She's going to pass.
Wow.
My dad said, Dr. Powers, he said, I appreciate your knowledge. He said, and I appreciate everything you've done for our family. He said, but I know the God who gave you that knowledge. And he told me she's going home. He said, well, Reverend Goff, it's good you have that faith.
Was he a believer?
He was not.
Wow.
He was not. And he said, well, Reverend Goff, it's good you have that faith. And they took Chelsea off the machine that night, and she was home 3 days later.
Awesome, man.
And they've done testing on her. They brought her back in till she was 2 or 3 years old and did all kinds of physical testing and all kinds of mental testing. And Chelsea was always at the top percentile with her mental testing and everything. And she's just always been a smart girl. And the doctors don't know how to explain what happened at all.
Yeah.
And we went back to Kaiser, and Dr. Heller was just shaking his head. He goes, I just can't believe this. And but we had lived there in San Jose, working with Dad at the church, and we actually moved in with Mom and Dad going with all this because we just had so much medical things.
Yeah.
And I'd been laid off from Lockheed Missile and Space. I worked there for 2.5 years on the Hubble Space Telescope project. That was my first job off the road.
Cool.
But
What a job.
yeah. But we lived there with Mom and Dad, and we would just take care of them. And then Blake all at once had another episode and had to be hospitalized. And this time while he's hospitalized, had him in a room. He didn't need a ventilator, nothing like that. And so that he wasn't in a critical room to where they could do that quickly.
Yeah.
And I watched, and he got so bad one day that he couldn't breathe, and they had to manually bag him with her hand. And Blake was looking dead into my eyes, just straight in my eyes, help me, Dad, help me, Dad. And there's nothing I could do. And it's just the most helpless feeling you can ever have. But Blake, while he was there, they were running intravenously. They were running a needle in, and they were giving him a potassium chloride transfusion, or giving him that. They were running a session on that. And what happens is it's in your vein, and if it gets infiltrated, it will get out, and it gets in, and it's like fire, and it actually will burn you. And Blake has a 3rd-degree burn on his arm where it got infiltrated.
Wow.
And it was just clear to the bone that he got burned. And but anyway, we were there, and my brother had called us from Arizona, and he wanted us to move down there. And the kids were older, and things were going better. And I would catch myself going into Blake's room for years at night and just put my hand on his chest to make sure he was breathing. I would do that for so long.
Yeah.
And But my brother was in Arizona. He pastored there, and he asked us to come down. He wanted me to work with him at the church. And so Kevin had called us down, and we were there working with him, and we were there for, I think it was 2 months. And we were there working at the church, and let me see, we moved there May, June, July. It was 2 months later that we're there one night, and get a phone call at home, and it's 1:30 in the morning, and they said, you need to get to the hospital right away. Your brother and his family has been in a very serious car accident, and they had been hit by a diesel truck and stood by my 9-year-old nephew's bed until he passed away. And it was just, that was a hard time because we were very close to our nephews, still are, but we were very close to Brandon. And my brother and his wife, through some of their testimony stuff, they had got divorced and remarried and divorced. And they had gotten divorced and remarried. And when they were divorced, those boys stayed with me and Lisa in California. And we would watch them a lot while Kevin worked. And we got real close and attached to those boys. And but it was that we went through that. And then a month later, I'm sitting at work, and because I went to work for a computer company selling hardware and software to major corporations, I took over my brother Kevin's book because he had left to go back into full-time ministry. And I got a call, and it was Lisa, and she said, Chris, she said, you got to get home. Blake caught on fire. And I said, and he was 8 at this time, and Chelsea was 6. I go, well, what do you mean you caught on fire? Did you bandage him up or whatever? She goes, no, you don't understand. He caught on fire. She said, you need to come home. I threw my headset down. I took off running, and I'm driving 90-0 to get home. And I got pulled over by a police officer, and he said, you going to a fire? What's going on? I said, actually, yes, my son's caught on fire. And he said, give me your address. I give him my address, and he gave me a police escort all the way home to my house. But got there, and Blake was reaching up to grab a toy off of the kitchen sink or the bathroom sink, and there was a scented candle lit. Got the bottom of his sleeve, and his shirt burst into flames. It was before fire retardant clothing. And he got 3rd-degree burns on 33% of his body. And Chelsea had tried to roll him and tried to put him out, and they finally got him into the tub and put him out. But I got there. When I finally got there, I ran in, and I'm looking at Blake, and I'm holding him, and he's smoldering. I mean, there's still smoke coming off his body, and I started saying out loud, I said, God, why? Why, God, after all these years of ministry, after all the years of what our family has done, and not trying to put, that's just where your process goes.
Sure.
And it said, God, why? And Blake starts tapping me on the back, He goes, Dad. And I said, yes. And he goes, it's all going to be okay.
Wow.
And man, if that don't make you go, huh?
Yeah.
And he's sitting there smoldering, and his shirt just charred to his body, and it's all going to be okay.
Wow.
And he had to get skin grafts, and he had to have all kinds of things happen with that, and went through a lot. But man, I hate to backtrack. Before we left Arizona, I have to go back to this real quick. You can edit whatever.
That's okay. Go ahead.
But before we left Arizona, or before we left for Arizona, we had gone to see Dr. Heller, and Dr. Heller, and we wanted to see him because we had got so close to him, and he loved the kids, and we went to see him before we left, and we walked into his office. We're sitting across like this, talking to him across the desk, and I look over on his desk, and there's a picture of Blake and Chelsea on his desk with all of his grandkids and his family.
Wow.
And I looked over, and Lisa goes, "He's got a picture of Blake and Chelsea." He goes, "Oh yeah, of course I do." He said, "They're my prized patients." And he said, "Chris," he said, "if there's anything that's ever been proven to me," he said, "I tell all my patients now," he said, "if you don't do anything," he said, "pray for your patients." He said, "That's been proven to me that there is power in prayer." And he had become a believer, and he had given his heart to God because of the process that he had seen of the miracles that were unexplained. And he said, I couldn't do it anymore. He said, because I watched it before my eyes.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're still here with Blake with his cardiomyopathy deal. And Blake's 8 when he caught on fire. Well, come up to when he was about 14, he got really sick, and his lungs got bad. We had to take him to the doctor, and next thing you know, they've got him hospitalized. And we're in there, and while I'm in there, I'm telling them, he's got cardiomyopathy, and they said, we've got to get a cardiologist up here right away. He could be going into congestive heart failure. So they brought him in, and after he looked at Blake and everything, he called us in, me and Lisa, and he said, "I want to show you guys something." He said, "Come into the room." We went into an X-ray where there was a whiteboard, and he had these X-rays up on the board. And he said, "If you look here," he said, "on this X-ray," he said, you see the ribs and everything." And he said, "But there's all this white." And he said, "There's that big thing, that big circle right there within the ribs." And I said, and he goes, that's your son's heart." And he said, "That's all the air and stuff that was all compressed around it." He said, "Now, if you look over at this X-ray," he said, "it's all black. You can still see the ribs and stuff." He said, "And that big thing there," he said, "that's the heart where it was big and stuff over here. Now, on this X-ray, you see where it's smaller and all that air's gone." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That's your son's heart now." And he said, "Your son's cardiomyopathy is gone."
Wow.
And Blake was healed from cardiomyopathy.
My goodness.
And but one thing that I can say is I've never seen one human being go through so many things in his life. And that's why I was touched by my nephew. He started this thing, Be Like Blake. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to cry, but it was very touching to me because I was there. Yeah. I was there when his shirt was burned on his body, and he was on fire, and he was smoking, and I was there with him. And to watch my son's disposition, and to watch how much he loves God.
Yeah. And
he doesn't ever, I've never heard, I've never seen that before. I've never seen him do anything but worship. I've never seen him.
He's never blamed God for things that have happened to him in his life. That's pretty awesome.
And, then, while all this was going on, we lived there in Phoenix, and I had left the computer industry and went to work for Wells Fargo Bank, and I was there for about 7 months, and they had asked me to they gave me a promotion. Then my district manager where I was had moved up to a little town called Prescott, Arizona, and she said, and when she got up there, she's there for about a year, and she called me and she said, "Chris, would you consider moving up here and running our business for the bank up here?" And I said, "Just because it's you, yes, I would consider that." And so we did that, and Lisa was an avid hiker. And her and my daughter, they love to go on walks and do all that kind of stuff. And Prescott is just one of the most beautiful. It's the closest thing in Arizona you're going to get to Tennessee. And it's got trees and it's gorgeous. And we're living up there, and they would do a lot of hiking and everything. And then my brother Randy was living out there, and he and I played a lot of music together. We had played a lot of country music together. Mm-hmm. And I had gotten away during all this process of between when Blake had caught on fire to when all this was going on. I had been playing in the bars and playing country music for years, and had started drinking and had started and I think I really started blaming God for a lot of stuff, and I became very bitter. And even though I never can say that I never hated God, I never was mad. I mean, I was mad at God, but I was never at a point to where I didn't believe or I didn't trust.
Right.
Still, I mean, if something happened, I knew I was running to Daddy. I was running to God. You know,
Sure.
God was, and because that's what my mom and dad instilled into us. But we had moved up there, and Randy, my brother, we were playing at a club up there, and Randy said, "I've got my buddy coming to town from California, and we're going to go fishing and stuff." And Lisa said, "I know exactly the place," and because he was asking me, "Do you know anywhere good up here?" And Lisa goes, "I've got just the place." And I rolled my eyes because I knew where she was going to talk about. It's a place where it was like 20 miles, 18 miles off the beaten path. I mean, there was no freeways, no lights. There was nothing around. There was this big power plant out in the middle of the trees and stuff that were out there. This was over by Strawberry, Arizona, over by Payson. And there's a place out there called Child's Power Plant. And she had talked about wanting to go there for years. She had the couple of years we had lived there, she had heard about it, and there's natural hot springs you could sit in, and it was just beautiful. Yeah. And she goes, "I got just the place," and so that's what she's going to set him up a place there. And Randy was just grateful, and so it was very strange. And Lisa and Chelsea came to the bank one day and I was running a bank, and she drove through and she said, "I want to get some money and I want to me and Chelsea's going to go get this camp set up." And I said, "Well, they're not going to be here for 2 days. 3, or what am I saying? It was going to be 4 or 5 days. I said, "It's still 4 or 5 days until they're going to be there." And she goes, "Well, we want to go up there for a couple of days and go hiking and go venturing." And I said, "Well, hon, you don't have a weapon. You don't have a gun. We don't have anything." And she goes, "We've got the dogs. We're fine. Nobody's going to bother us." So I finally gave in. I told her, I said, "I don't want you to go." I said, "What if you ran off the side of the road? What if there were big cliffs and stuff?" I said, "What if you went down a cliff and nobody knew what was going on? Nobody knew what happened?" She said, "We'll be fine." So they were gone for 3 days or 2 days. They were gone 2 days, and all at once I looked on my computer one day, and all at once I looked at MySpace, and MySpace in 2008 was the thing then. Yeah. And I looked, and I had this message from this girl. Her name was Sherry. She had long dark hair, and he spelled her name Shari. And I said, "There's only one Sherry that I know that spells her name like that." And it was Sherry, who I'd met in Ridgecrest or in San Jose, California, the year before I met Lisa. And she said, "I was cleaning out my closet," and she said, "and I came across some of your family's old records, and you probably don't remember me, but I just wanted to send you a message and say hi to you and just tell you your family's beautiful. I'm so glad you're doing well." I wrote her back and talked to her, and I had wanted to get a hold of her uncle, and I wanted to ask some information before I called him, some things that had happened in their lives, and I didn't want to feel stupid when I called him. So I called and I talked to her real quick, and I got Jeff's number, and we spoke, and then I called Jeff and talked to him. But anyway, that was on Friday, and the following Wednesday, Randy was coming back down. No, that was Saturday. The following Wednesday, Randy was coming back down, and we were going to go down to Child's Power Plant where Lisa had set everything up. And so we had set it all up, and Randy called me, and he came down, and I had a guitar player that was staying at my house that played in our band because we were going to be playing later that night, but he wanted to go out and just get set up real quick at the campsite for the next day. And they had us playing a special night at this club for some reason on a Wednesday. I think it was an event for the city, maybe. Anyway, me and Randy stopped at a little market. Lisa had a problem with her cell phone, and she had called me a couple days earlier, and she said, "My phone's not working. It's not charging. I don't know what's going on." She said, "So the charger's not working, so we may be without a cell phone for a couple days." And I said, "That's not cool." And she goes, "Well, it is what it is. We'll run to town in a couple of days, but I don't want to do it right now." So all at once, me and Randy were at this market getting ready to go up to where the campsite was. And Randy, we're up paying for things, and all at once my phone started ringing. It was Lisa. And I said, "Well, Lisa's calling me now. They must have already got that charger and got back up there. They're going to get a phone charger and get ice and come back to the camp." And I answered it and I said, hey, what's going on? I said, you obviously already got your charger. She goes, no. She said, I just turned my phone on real quick and it powered up. And I don't, but I just went ahead and called you. But we're on our way now to go get the charger in the ice and we'll see you in a few. She said, but wait till you get up here. She said, it's gorgeous. The wind's blowing through the trees. She said, the water's clear. And she said, the birds are singing. She said, and she's trying to paint a picture for me. And she said, it's just beautiful. She said, we should just spend the night up here tonight and build a fire and just talk by the fire after you guys get finished playing and just stay up here with them tonight. And I said, we'll talk about when I get up there. She was that nature camping kind of person. And I was more of a hotel resort shower kind of guy. And
we're much on roughing it, huh?
no. And so I think I'd been in too many churches where we couldn't take a quick shower before we went to sing. It's like I have to have a shower every morning now.
Sir.
But me and Randy, we're sitting there talking. She said, we should spend the night. I said, well, we'll talk about when I get there. She goes, okay, well, hon, I love you and I'll see you soon. So me and Randy got in the car and he was following me and because he was going to leave his car out there and we were going to come back out there later that night. And when we got out there, we got just before you go down into the camp, my phone started ringing and I answered the phone and it was my guitar player. And Gary said, Chris, there's someone here that needs to talk to you. I could tell by the sound of his voice something was wrong. Yeah. And I said, man gets on the phone and goes, Mr. Goff. He said, this is Sergeant so-and-so from Prescott Valley Police Department. He goes, do you know where your daughter is? I said, I sure do. I said, she's right down here in a camp and we're getting ready to go meet her and her and my wife. And he goes, no, she's up on the Beeline Highway, which is one of the most dangerous. If you look it up, it's one of the most dangerous highways in the United States. And it runs between Payson up in the White Mountains and Strawberry and all up in the White Mountains there on the Mogollon Rim. And he said she's been in a very serious car accident. And he said, we're getting ready to life flight her to Scottsdale Memorial and you need to get there as soon as possible. And I said, well, what about my wife? And he goes, what about your wife? And I said, he goes, you're going to have to call the officer on the scene. And he said, I don't know about any other person. And I said, okay. So I hung up with him and I pulled over and I ran back and I told Randy what was going on. He said, I can't believe Lisa let her run to town by herself. That just doesn't even make any sense. But we got down into the camp and everything and we look and she had this huge camp set up. That's the way she always did everything. It was just elaborate. She made it so nice for them. And, but there was clothes everywhere and there was water, there was clothes and everything everywhere. But it had rained and they were drying them all out. So I reached down and I got my phone and I called the number that he gave me. And I'm like, and looking back at this, I'm like, why did I get my phone? Because I knew the phone didn't get phone service down there. Yeah. And it didn't the next day when I went down. But I went down and I called the number of the officer, the sheriff that was on the scene. He said, Mr. Goff, he said, your daughter's been in a serious car accident and she's not looking good. It's not looking like she's going to make it. And I said, yeah, that's what the officer had told me. We said, what about my wife? He goes, well, can you describe her to me? I said, yeah. I said, she's about 99 pounds, long blonde hair and blue. And I stopped. And I said, she's got long blonde hair and blue, started to say blue eyes. And I just dropped the phone and I took off and I started running around the camp and grabbing pillows and grabbing her clothes and smelling them, trying to get her scent. Mm-hmm. And my brother picked up the phone and they told her that she was killed instantly in the car accident.
Wow.
And so it was crazy. And again, I can't say, looking back, I don't know why I did this, but now I do. But we got in the car and we started going down to Scottsdale Memorial Hospital. And I grabbed my phone and I looked down and the number I saw was Sherry's number. And I hit the button. I said, hey, my wife has just been killed in a car accident. My daughter's over here. I said, please be praying with us. She said, of course I'll be praying, so, but little did I know, we got there and they had interviewed and done all kinds of, they'd done all kinds of things with Chelsea. I've got pictures of Chelsea and she looks, it's crazy if you look at her and know that she made it, that she lived, because it was just the most gruesome thing.
So she had left the scene and was just walking down the highway?
No, I'm sorry. Really? No, so what had happened is they were driving down the road and the best of Chelsea's recollection, they looked down to change the radio, and they got on the lip of the road, and it pulled them off the road, and it went up an embankment and came back down, and it rolled.
Yeah.
And it threw my wife out of the car, and the car came down on her. And then another car came along and hit the car, but they ran Lisa over in the process.
Oh, man.
And so ran Lisa over and hit the car. And then when they got there, one of my dogs they couldn't find. My other dog jumped out of my car and ran and jumped in the car that hit them, that ran my wife over and hit them.
Yeah.
And a couple days later, a lady died that was in that car as well. But they had to cut Chelsea out of the car, and they started saying, "Do you know where you are? And do you know who's driving?" She goes, "Yeah, I was driving." They said, "Do you know where you are?" She goes, "Yeah, we're on the dirt road." Well, the previous day they were driving down a dirt road, and they had a minor fender bender with someone, and it was nothing. And Chelsea was driving then, and but there was no damage, and so everybody went on. But Chelsea's recollection went back to that, and she said, "Yeah, I was driving." We still don't know to this day that Chelsea was driving the car. But anyway, they cut Chelsea out, and they took her and they life flighted her. And we got down to Scottsdale, and we were there in the hospital with her for weeks. And it was just incredible, just crazy. And during this time, Bobby, and I don't know how to explain it, because I was looking back, it's pretty crazy. I started calling Sherry. I called Sherry, and I would go back home. I'd go back to my house, and I would lay in my room, and I would swear that I heard my wife's voice in the other room, and she was getting ready to walk in the door. Yeah. She's going to walk into the bedroom. And then my brain would say, "It's not possible. She's gone. Yeah. She's gone."
Yeah.
And but that was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, is when I had to go identify her from the car accident. But I got home, and Sherry had texted and had asked how everything was going, and I told her what was happening, and she said, "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." And so whenever I was laying in my bedroom, and I would swear I was going to share that Lisa was going to walk into the room, and I heard her voice, I looked down and I called her, and I talked to her, and she said, "I'm here to talk to you. I'm here to help you." Little did I know that she was at the end of an abusive marriage that she was in, that she had to get out of, her and her son.
Yeah.
And she became, I just can't even explain how God orchestrated all this. I can't explain it. And I had physically taken my clothes and moved down to Phoenix and stayed with some good friends. We've known for years. We used to sing at their camps and their dad's church and everything else. And they had me just come stay with them while we were getting the funeral arrangements and everything made. And they would come and they would look around for me, and I would be laying under their pool table, and they didn't know it. And I'd be talking quiet to Sherry. And me and Sherry would be talking. And next thing you know, me and Sherry were talking. And next thing I know, I'm falling for Sherry. Yeah. And here we are just a few weeks into this whole process. Yeah. And they asked me, they said, "What's going on?" I said, "Come on, we got to talk." And I took them in, and they were such good friends, man. I set them down and I told them everything that was going on. And they said, "Chris, we don't judge you whatsoever. We know how this is all, we know." Me and Sherry had not spoke. Me and Sherry had nothing going on. We had not spoke before any of this. Yeah. And there was a lot that went on with all of that. Even working with my brother at the church, and you have to take time off because you're going into this so quick. People are going to think things are going on. Right. And so, the church world. And during this time, just before Sherry, I was actually going to move to Washington, and she was going to let me work on music or anything else I wanted. She had an incredible job making probably 3 times what I was making, and she was just a smart girl. She had her life together. Yeah. And but anyway, she goes, "You've got your music and everything going in Arizona. We're going to move to Arizona." So they up and moved to Arizona with us, and we got married the following December, or November 30th, actually. But I had, in the meantime, when I had left I actually left my brother's church when all that was going on, because it kind of gave us some hard feelings, because I didn't agree with his decision. And hindsight 2020, I get what he was doing, Yeah. And but anyway, there was a guy who played another guitar player in our band named Corey, and he was a Christian guy. And most of the guys who played in our bands, we had a lot of Christian guys that played in our band. And Corey had just cut a Christian record, and he was going to be doing a CD release, and they were going to be doing it at his church. And he was on staff at this big Nazarene church in Phoenix, Glendale, Arizona. And we went there for this, and we did this release with him, and me and my brother and our band, really. And we did this concert with him and did all of his original songs. At the end of his Christian concert there, somebody started screaming, "Free bird, free bird." And Corey looks back at me, and he looks at the pastor, and pastor kind of shrugs and goes, "Whatever," because free bird, he wasn't worried about free bird.
Right.
He was such a cool pastor. But he looks back, and next thing you know, Corey goes, "Yeah, fine." And so I sang Free Bird. Yeah. And we did it, and the people just freaked out. It was a lot of fun. Yeah. And but afterwards, the pastor had gone to Corey, and he said, "Corey," he said, "do you think Chris would be interested in coming on staff with us part-time and taking the older service, the traditional service in the morning and leading the hymns and stuff?" And so they talked to me about it, and I felt good. And by this time, God had got a hold of my life, and I was back in the right frame of mind. And when Sherry came into my life, a lot of things just started changing in my life that I can't explain. It was God orchestrating. And so went on staff there at that church. And before I did, I called that pastor aside, and I said, "Pastor Page," I said, "Pastor Michael," I said, "before we do this, I want you to know what I'm going through right now." And I said, "I've been dating this girl for about a month and a half. And I said, but I love her." And I said, "But my wife, she's only been gone for 2 months." And and everybody is, and he goes, "Chris, I know you." He said, "I love you." And he said, "I love your heart." And he said, "I don't have one issue with this." Yeah. So we were on staff there for 2.5 years. And after his service there, he married us at the church after a Sunday service. Cool. There at the church. And it was pretty amazing. And it was a time that God orchestrated. It was a time of healing for me. Yeah. And it was a time of healing with Sherry coming to my life, and being on the staff at that church was just the most incredible thing. It was just what I needed at that time. Yeah. And I was very ministered. It was just very ministered to. But then all at once, I was at work one day because I was still working at the bank up at Prescott, and I looked down in my computer and I saw that Wells Fargo was in Nashville. And I clicked the button, and I called my wife. I said, "You're going to know what I just did." And she goes, "What?" And I said, "I just applied for a job in Nashville as a branch manager." She goes, "You what?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I don't have to take the job. It's a good interview process, and we just see what they." She goes, "Well, yeah." She goes, "Well, hun," she goes, and I got home, and she said, "Hun, if you think God wants us in Nashville," she goes, "I'll go wherever you think God wants us. I'm with you." She said, "Awesome." Yeah. And so we ended up moving to Nashville and came here, and I wanted to get around Mom for the final years of life and get to spend time with her. And then we've lived here for 12 years now. But just back in September of September of the year before, on September 5th, we were on a cruise, and Sherry, we were walking down some steps, and Sherry, there was wet stairs, and she slipped and lost footing, broke her ankle in 3 places. And so for 9 months, and what was crazy is at this time we were remodeling our house, and we were remodeling our kitchen, remodeled our floors. And we came back from vacation, and we had just laid the floors at our house, got home from vacation. All the floors were buckled in our house. And we came home to the floors buckled and her broken ankle. And so they had to come in and redo all this, and just everything went crazy for this short period of time. But 9 months she was laying in bed. She couldn't get out of bed. And Blake watched her through all this process. And this was pretty cool because Blake watched her have to learn how to walk again. Yeah. Because she was in bed for 9 months. She had to get up and start limping around and use walkers and, and all the machines that you have to use. And so Blake got to watch all this because he lived with us. Mm-hmm. And she has referenced back to this with a lot of what we have going on now. Yeah. But Blake went to his, this was just back in September, and it was a year to the day of when Sherry had her accident on the ship. Blake was at church on a Wednesday night with a friend of his, and his friend and him were goofing off, and they were wrestling around and roughhousing, and his friend just kind of hit him in the hip. He said, "I'll get you," and he hit him in the hip, and there was nothing thought about it. Mm-hmm. Well, 2 days later, Blake says, "Dad, Sherry, come here," and went up there, and he goes, "I can't move my legs." And I go, "What?" And we didn't know what was going on, and I mean, it was just out of nowhere. And Sherry helped him get up, and so this is a day and stuff. And so Sherry's standing there talking to him, and he could move them a little bit the first day, but it was like he must have like hurt his back, must have done something. Well, the next morning, Sherry went in to check on him, and she got him up, and he's standing at the edge of the bed, and his legs keep starting to buckle, and she's having to hold him up. And all at once she looks down, and he's wet all over the front of his pants, and she's like, "What's going on?" He goes, "I don't know. I don't know." Yeah. Blake couldn't walk. So, and what's crazy with this story, and I know we're going so long right now, there was so much during this story, Bobby, that God orchestrated through this time that just blew my mind and still blows my mind just thinking about it. Yeah. And I'm part of a Rotary Club where I was running a bank in White House, and they had asked me to get up and to speak. And the man, they had found out that I had been in music, and he said, "Do you still sing?" And I said, "I do still sing." And he said, "Would you be willing to come?" He said, I have the Rotary Club meeting this next week, but I don't have a program. He said, "Would you be willing to bring a keyboard and sing for us and tell a little bit about your family and the story of your family?" Because he knew about the sick kids and everything. Yeah. And I said, "Sure." So I went to the Rotary Club, and I sang for them and led, and talked about the kids and did the singing and stuff. And when I was finished, there were people that came up to me. This one guy came up to me from the Rotary. He was part of the Rotary Club, and he said, "Chris," he said, "Man," he goes, "I want to get together with you." He said, "There's just something, I don't know." He said, "I want to get to know you, man." And he gave me his card, and his name's Zach, and Zach Talton, and he's just an incredible dude. And so I said, "Sure, man." So this was 2 weeks later. Now that Blake was having the issue with where he couldn't walk, we had to take him to the hospital. We got to the hospital, and the ambulance driver said, "We'll let them know that he's special needs," because from his brain hemorrhage, he's special needs. Yeah. Got there, and we couldn't get back there to where he was. We couldn't get back, and
this was during
COVID and all that. Yes,
the mask and social distancing and all that.
Exactly. Yeah. It was all during all that time.
Yeah.
And when we're at the hospital, I came back and I got on the phone, and God puts these people in your life that always is just, and it's God's plan. And I called Dave and Tiffany Barnett. And I called Tiffany and told her they weren't letting me get back with Blake. She said, "Let me send a text to someone." She sent a text, and she called me back and said, "In a few minutes, I want you to call back in there." In fact, I had called in there, and I said, "Hey, you got my son back there. He's special needs. He can't tell you anything that's going on." This lady goes, "I understand, sir. You're just going to have to wait." And I said, "Ma'am, my son can't give a description of what happened." She goes, "You need to slow your roll. There's people back here having heart attacks." And I was like, "Slow my roll?" And so next thing you know, I talked to Tiffany, and I'd called back in, and she said, "I told them you could come back here an hour ago. Come on back." So I got in there, and anyway, and they had the story all wrong, and it was crazy. But while I was waiting, I was sitting with Sherry, and I said, "You know what?" I said, there was a Rotary thing the next day. And I was supposed to be, they were having a Goff scramble thing to where they were going to be doing a fundraiser for kids. And I was supposed to work it with them. And I said, "I've got to call somebody at the Rotary and tell them." And I said, "I don't know what to do." I said, "I don't have anybody's number." And then I said, "Wait a minute." And I looked down in my glove compartment, and there was Zach Talton's card. So I called Zach. I said, "Zach, I just want to let you know what's going on." And I told him what was happening with Blake. And I started telling him, I said, "But, he can't walk right now." And I said, "But we're not worried." He goes, "Well, are you freaking out?" And I said, "No." I said, "God's got this. I'm not going to freak out. I've already been through so much now, man, that God's brought us through now. He's going to bring us through this too." Yeah. And he goes, "Well, and you're calling me because?" And I kind of looked at Sherry, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't have called him. Maybe is he offended? And he goes, "Oh, no, just keep on telling me." So I kept telling him the story. Well, it was a couple of days later, Zach calls me, and he goes, "Chris," he said, "little did you know," he said, "years ago, I had a tuberculosis. And he said, and I had gotten better and got over that and stuff. But then after that, they had found out that I had a rare form of cancer. And but it had gone into remission. Everything was good. He said, but I was coming to an annual checkup. And he said, it was the day after you called me, the day of my checkup. And he said, and I already knew the cancer was back. He said, I felt it. I knew this was going on. And he said, I started freaking out. I started getting scared. And he said, my faith was low. And he said, and I was just not in a good place mentally. He said, and you called me with your son and what was going on. And he said, you were talking about the faith. And he said, and I was when you had given your testimony at the Rotary Club and everything that God had brought through. And he said, after I talked to you, he said, man, I said, what am I worried about?
Yeah.
And he said, and I walked in, and he said, that next day I walked into the doctor, and he goes, man, he goes, I got some bad news. And he goes, the cancer's back. And he goes, I know. He goes, how do you know? He said, I knew it was back. He said, I knew. He goes, they said, well, we're concerned. He said, because we're afraid that this is going to rekindle and restart your tuberculosis. And he goes, I'm not worried about it. It's not going to happen. Yeah. And he goes, what do you mean it's not going to happen? He said, it's not going to happen. He said, I know it's not. He said, I know God's got me. And he said, I'm not going to worry about it. And he said, well, what about all the times that you've told me things that were going to happen, they didn't happen, the things that weren't going to happen that have happened? Mm-hmm. He goes, you guys don't know. He said, you guys aren't in control. He said, God's in control. Wow. And he said, and Chris, I walked in there with so much faith. And he said, that was not an accident. And it's when you look at how God orchestrates life, man. I mean, all that with Sherry and how she came back, and I all at once out of nowhere had to give this presentation at the Rotary Club to meet Zach, to tell Zach this before he's going into his, cancer treatment deal and into his cancer conversation, that God puts everything in place at the right time, at a specific time for a specific purpose. Yeah. And we don't know what's going on. No. And so we sit here all through life going, God, why? God, why? Yeah. So when all this was going on, Sherry wasn't with me yet. She wasn't with me at this time. I'd gone up to the room. They'd finally got Blake into a room, and I walked in, and I'm sitting with Blake in the room, and the doctor had come up, and he said, the doctor hadn't come up yet. I was sitting with the nurses, and I said, yeah, they gave me a bad time down there, and I said, I don't even know what kind of story Blake has given them, and come to find out they had got information that was just totally incorrect. Yeah. I mean, totally incorrect. Yeah. Because the doctor started saying, well, when his friend hit him and he fell to the ground and blah, blah, blah. And I said, none of that happened like that. Yeah. And but anyway, I asked the nurses, I said, so with this COVID thing, I said, what's our visiting situation? She goes, well, now that you're here, you're the only one that can be here for the entire stay. Uh-huh. And I said, for the entire stay? She said, yes. And she said, you can be here from 4 to 6:30. And I said, that's all? Yes, you can be here from 4 to 6:30 and no one else. All at once, another nurse walks into the room. She was the charge nurse, and she goes, that's the way it is for most of our patients. She said, but policy is different for this family. And she said, it has been approved for this dad to be here 24 hours a day. And if he can't be here, his wife can be here. And I was like, wow. So they were going to let us go up at separate times, but get to be up there with him, Yeah. So after that happened, the doctor comes in, Dr. Acosta comes in, and he starts talking about Blake, and starts telling me about what they're seeing. And his spine was very compressed at the top and at the bottom of his spine. And they were talking about having to do a surgery. And they were going to have to, kind of like if you're sitting in a room, they have to knock walls out to make the room bigger. They were going to have to go in and remove bone from his spine to make it bigger, to where he had room in there for things to move around. And because it was so compressed, and they were going to have to do a decompression. But, and I have a lot of this on what God told me to start doing through this process, was start recording everything that was being said. And I have it all on my phone. I have every conversation with every doctor. Yeah. And he said, Chris, he said, right now we are where we are. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, what this means is your son's not going to walk again. And I said, excuse me? He said, in all probability, in all likelihood, your son is not going to ever walk again. And I said, not walk again. He said, correct. And so I was just, I just was broken, and I started thinking in my mind. I kind of started having a panic attack, and I was like, I've got to have Sherry. Yeah. And the nurse came in, and I told her what was going on, and she goes, oh dear. And I said, look, and I started just telling her a little bit, look, I've had a son die. I've had son, but this boy has caught on fire. My wife died. I told her all these things that had happened. I said, I can't be up here alone with all this. I have to have my wife here. She looked at me real funny. She walked out. No, when she comes back, she goes, you go ahead and call your wife and tell her to come up. It's been approved.
Awesome. Yeah.
So Sherry came up, and we were with Sherry that entire time. And but while we were there, man, we got to know guards. We got to know nurses. We got to know all these people. We walked in to a guard one day, and she said, would you mind if I came up and sang for your son? And because she knew that we were into music, and she came up and sang His Eye is on the Sparrow for Blake. Mm-hmm. But we went through the process of everything, and with this COVID situation, everything at the hospital was just really crazy. Yeah. It was funky. People would want to get in to see their family. They couldn't. Right. And but visiting hours didn't apply to us. And that's what was crazy, because we could be there 24/7, both of us. Yeah. And it was God opened the door to be able to do that.
That's definitely God right there. Because a lot of people during that time, they couldn't visit their family in the hospital, their loved one in the hospital. They couldn't visit them at a nursing home.
Yeah.
Baby being born, you couldn't go in there. It was crazy.
Yeah, COVID, they had it all locked down.
You had some favor there, but
man, I'm telling you, there's a lady who worked for me, and her mom was ill, and she couldn't even go to the hospital to be with her mom. But anyway, we're up there, and all this has been going on, and they do one surgery, and they do this surgery, and we come back up there, and they knew that we both wanted to be with Blake, so they didn't take him to recovery. They took an unused hospital room that was out separate from everything else, and they moved Blake's bed into there so so me and Sherry could come be with him, because they couldn't do it for other families. They weren't going to do that. Oh. And so me and Sherry got to be in the room with Blake during his recovery. And so God told me at this time, start recording everything, start videotaping everything, and start going on Facebook, and I want you to document a miracle. Because he's going to walk again. Yeah. He's God's, God spoke that to my heart, and He said He is going to walk again, and this is going to be a miracle, and I want you to document it. Yeah. Number two, I wanted to keep Blake's ministry going, because you see Blake on Facebook. He loves to play and sing, and he just loves, he loves to worship. And we're doing that, and so he sings for his nurse, and this is just 30 minutes after coming out of surgery. Blake's singing Amazing Grace to his nurse, and we're videotaping. Yeah. But then after this happens, and we've not even talked about this publicly at all yet, because God hadn't allowed me to, but Blake had been teasing me, and he goes, I bet you're going to be scared while I'm in there in surgery, Dad. And I said, son, no, I'm not. I said, God's got you. I said, I'm not worried at all. You're going to rest peacefully. He goes, amen. So after he sang for the nurse, Mom had called in, my mom, and wanted to FaceTime to where she could see Blake. And we're sitting there talking. I told Mom, he said, Blake told my mom, he said, I told Dad he was probably going to be worried while I was laying in there having surgery. And I said, I wasn't. He goes, yeah, you told me God had me. And Mom goes, well, did you get some good rest? He goes, I did. I said, did you? I said, oh yeah. I said, you got good rest? I said, do you remember anything? He looks at me, and he goes, actually, Dad, I do. And you would have to know Blake to know that Blake can't tell a story. His brain, his short-term memory does not allow him to. I'll walk in, I'll say, what happened in therapy today? I don't remember. So Blake said, actually, I do, Dad. I said, what? And he said, I was in heaven. And me and Sherry looked at each other, and he said, I walked in, and he said, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. He said, I walked in, and he said, and there was angels. There was an angel choir, and they started singing. Wow. They started singing to me, and I said, do you remember the song? And he goes, I do. And I have this on video. And he starts singing this, welcome home, Blake, welcome home. And he sings this song, and me and Sherry look at each other, and I've never heard this tune. I've never heard a song like this. Mm-hmm. And then he started saying that he remembered seeing specific people in the angel choir. He saw Kenny Henson. He saw Dottie Rambo. He saw Larry Henson. And he named people that he saw in the choir. Yeah. And he named people that I did not even know how he knew who they were. Hovey Lester, and naming people that I'm like, Jesse Dixon. And I'm like, how does he know these names? Yeah. So anyway, he said, then I walked in, Dad, and he said, and I saw Papa. And he said, and he called him Papa Monster, is what they used to call. That was my dad's nickname, Papa Monster. And he said, and he grabbed me and he hugged me, and he just hugged me. He said, Blake, I've missed you, buddy. Welcome home. It's so good to see you. And he said they were all just gathered around fellowshipping, and he said, and they were fishing. And I said, who? And he said, well, it was Papa. He said, Grandma and Grandpa Goff, which he did not know them, my dad's mom and dad. Yeah. And he said, and Nana's mom and dad. And he said, and Mama Lisa, his mom and dad were there. Her mom and dad were there. And Sherry's grandma and grandpa were there, and they were all fishing. Well, what Blake didn't know is all these people that he named loved to fish.
Oh, wow.
Every one of them loved to fish. And he said the water
that kind of confirms it really happened.
Well, I'm telling you, and
I mean, all that stuff, and he didn't know.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And so we're sitting here, and he said, and then Dad, all at once, I looked, and he said there was some hills, and he said Mom was down in the foothills in the lower part, and he said, and she saw me, and she ran down there, and she grabbed me, and she gave me the biggest hug, and she kissed me on the cheek and said, Blake, I've missed you, son. It's so good to see you. She said, I love you so much. Welcome home. And she walked back to where everybody was with me, and then all at once these two men ran up to me, young men walked up and grabbed me. One of them grabbed me and hugged me. And he said, Blake, the brother I never got to meet, finally. And me and Sherry's just sitting here with our mouths open, and and he said, and it had to be my son Heath that died.
Yeah.
And then he said, and the young man that was with him, Dad? I said, yeah. And he said it was Brandon, which is my nephew that died in the car accident. Oh. And he said, old Blaker. I said, what did he say? He said, old Blaker, I've not seen you for decades. It's so good to see you, buddy. And Sherry goes, haven't seen you for decades? And he said, yeah. And it had been decades since he had seen him, 2 or 3 decades. Yeah. And Sherry stopped in and she goes, Blake, do you know what a decade is? And he goes, oh, I don't know, 10,000 years. So Blake would go in and out of this, but Blake was telling the story in sequence, and which was just tripping me out to begin with. And then all at once my phone rang, and it was Ronnie Henson. And Ronnie had called me through a lot of this process and helped me and talked to me, man, and ministered to me through all this process, and really became he was always a good friend, but just became a really close friend. Yeah. And we talked, and I started telling him, Blake's in there telling us that he went to heaven, and he goes, well, Doc, he goes, man, that's crazy. He goes, man, Doc, man, Chris, you got to write a book. And I said, God has told me this for 12 years. I've told my family. I said, God told me 12 years ago, I told my wife, I've got to write a book. And she said, well, then you need to do this. And I'd go to work, and God would have me share a little bit of my testimony with somebody on the other side of the desk. And they would say that whole week, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. Yeah. And so it was just God saying, hey, slapping me upside the head. Hey, dummy. I said, write a book.
Sounds like a movie too.
Well, and so I said, and I told Ronnie, I said, I've told them for years. I said, I'm going to, and as soon as I can get the title of this book, I'm gonna write it. He goes, I got your title. I said, oh yeah, and he goes, yeah, it's visiting hours. And I just felt like somebody poured warm water over my head, and it just went down to my toes. Yeah. And I knew it was God. Uh-huh. And I said, man, I got to get back in here. And I walked back into the room, and Sherry is just laying over Blake, just laying across and just crying. And I said, what is going on? Well, Sherry and I had been married for 12 years, but things had happened in Sherry's life that Blake didn't know about. She lost her uncle when she was 5 years old, and she lost her aunt 3 years before Sherry and I even got back together. Mm-hmm. And Blake didn't know this. Blake knew nothing about any of her family, knew none of this. Yeah. And Blake looked at her and said, Mama Sherry, don't you have an uncle and aunt that's in heaven? And that's when she fell across him and just started crying, because she knew. That was another confirmation. Yeah. We knew. And she goes, I do. And so she tells me what's going on, and then Blake goes, what was his name? And starts doing this, and Blake does this. He'll shake his hand in the air, and he'll snap his fingers. What was his name? What was his name? She goes, my uncle's name is Larry. He goes, yes, Larry. Larry was there. I saw Larry. Wow. And he said, and I saw your aunt. And they met me at the gate and walked me to where Dad was and everything, to where my dad was, his papa. And so all this happened, and so we're in the hospital. You know, we were there for 2 months. But while we're there one night, we're sitting there, and Blake said, "Dad, would you do me a favor?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "In the morning before you come in tomorrow morning, would you sing 'He's the Rock' for me?" And he still wasn't moving his toes. He wasn't moving legs, nothing. And "He's a Rock" is a song that I wrote back when the kids were in the hospital. And it's a song that God gave me. And "He's the rock you can stand on. He's the light that will guide you through life's troubled sea. When the storms are raging high, he will turn the angry tide. He's always been right there to meet your need." But anyway, I wrote this song, "He's the Rock," and Blake wanted me to sing it. So I woke up the next morning. How can you tell your boy no?
Yeah.
So I got on FaceTime and I sang it for him. And then we go up to the hospital and we're sitting there. And we go to lunch and we come back from lunch. And Blake's story on Facebook had gotten across Pakistan somehow, the Christian community in Pakistan. And I have so many friends now in Pakistan, ministers and preachers in Pakistan and pastors, and they would get on video with us and they would pray with us and they would sing and they would go around and introduce us to people in their church. It was just crazy, and they would sit there and pray for us while we're on video with them. And they would do this pretty much on a daily basis. Well, this day I had sang "He's the Rock," and then we're sitting here, and Alexander calls me, and I pick up the phone. We start talking, and then Alexander says, "I want to pray for you guys." So he starts praying, and he starts saying, and he's praying, and he's praying, and he says, "Blake will walk before Christmas. Blake will walk before Christmas." He said, "God says Blake will walk before Christmas. I prophesy now, Blake will walk before Christmas." And I said, "Wow." And then all at once he stops and he starts singing, "Hallelujah, hallelujah." Starts singing that song to us. And then we finished our talk and we went to dinner, Sherry and I. We came back. We have a good friend, Joel Perales. You probably remember Joel from the Galileans, who was also signed with us on Calvary Records with us and the Hensons. Well, his son just happened to be at the bank that I took over in Nashville, and we became just awesome friends. And I looked and I saw his name, and I said, "Jonathan Perales." I said, "Do you know anyone named Joel?" He goes, "You're messing with me. Who told you to say that?"
Wow.
But I said, "Man, your dad was with the Galileans in the 70s. He goes, "What's your name?" And I said, "Goff." And he goes, "Oh, you're one of the Goffs." Yeah. So we became friends. But anyway, Joel and his wife, Rose, has a Facebook ministry that they do every night. And when we came back from dinner, I looked down at my phone, and Joel and Rose was on. So I reached down and I clicked in and I started watching. And they have one of the old Galileans singing with them. They're singing 3-part harmony, and amazing. But they're singing this song, and it says, "He hides my." It wasn't "He hides my soul in the cleft of the rock." It was another song, but it was talking about hiding your soul in the rock. And I said, "Wow, the rock!" And I looked at Sherry and I said, "The rock. That must be our word for the day."
Yeah.
And then all at once, I look over at Blake, and while they're singing this song, and he's just got his hands raised as high and as wide as he can get them, and he's just worshiping, and he's just crying. He's just tears coming down his eyes. And all at once, me as a dad, I started welling up with tears, and I looked over at the door, at the hospital door, and the enemy started saying, "Man, you can't start crying. They're going to think something's wrong. They're going to think you and Sherry's having an argument. They're going to think you guys are fighting or something. You can't be in here crying. They're going to think something's going on." And so I started fighting back the tears. And all at once I looked back down at my phone, and the song was ending, and Joel goes, "Blake, Sherry, Chris, Goff, this is for you. This is for you." And then he says, "It's okay, Chris." He said, "It's okay. Go ahead and cry. It's okay. Go ahead and cry." And Sister Rose says, "Yes, it's okay. Cry. It's okay. Go ahead." And I looked over at Sherry and I said, "Can they see me?" And what's crazy is Sherry was videotaping Blake on her phone at the time. So all this is on videotape. And so I said, can they see me or something? And because it was crazy, because how did they know I was fighting back tears? And so all at once, Joel said, Blake, he said, Chris, Blake, Sherry, this song is for you. This song is for you. They start singing, hallelujah, hallelujah. Exactly what the man from Pakistan had started singing to us after he prophesied that Blake was going to walk again. Well, we started seeing process of everything going on and everything, and we're going through all this, and Pastor Dan comes and sees us. He goes, Chris, I got to see that boy. And I said, man, it's not going to happen. I said, there's no way they've already made provision. They've already made arrangements and let us do this. Mm-hmm. He goes, I'm not going to feel good unless I do this, unless I try. Yeah. I got to say I tried. Yeah. So he goes, come on. And Dan,
oh, yeah.
we walked into that area where the security guard sat, and there was a chair beside the security guard at the desk, and Dan just walks around the desk and sits beside him and puts his hand on his shoulder and goes, listen, man, this is family. This is family from my church. I pastor and I'm their pastor. And he goes, but they're my family. And he said, and I need to go up for 5 minutes, and I need to go up and pray for their son. I need to go up for 5 minutes and just pray with him. He goes, son, I can't. He said, sir, I can't allow that. I'm sorry. We can't do that. And he said, listen, I've got to do this. Who do I need to talk to? What do I need to do? He said, well, I need to call my officer, who's the officer in charge. And he said, get him on the phone. I want to talk to him. He said, just get him on the phone. So the security guard looks at him, and he gets the officer on the phone, and all at once he hangs up and he looks at Dan. He said, he told me to call up and talk to the charge nurse up there and let them know and to ask them. So next thing you know, he said, talks to the charge nurse. He said, okay, I'll send him right up. And he said, charge nurse says it's fine. You guys go on up. So they let Dan go up, and Dan, we got to sit and sing. In fact, it was on video too. Yeah, we sang them "I'll Fly Away" all together, and Blake's sitting here, can't move or anything else. But man, to watch that boy, and I say boy, he's going to be 31 years old. But to watch him worship, to watch him sing, to watch him, he's worried about going to church. He's worried about not being able to go to church. He's worried, and he didn't get to for a long time. And then there's finally this Easter, just this past Sunday, he got to go to church, and boy, he's like, Dad, can I go again next Sunday? Yeah. And I said, you sure can. And Sherry was she's missed church. She's been staying with him because I've been coming to playing drums. But anyway,
I was watching him. He was loving it, man.
Yeah, Sherry told me that he moved his little walker thing up there,
side of the stage,
and that he just stood the whole time, and that's something else, because for them to see that,
he was crying
and
worshiping,
absolutely. But during all this process, man, and we had all that happen, with Zach, and then this stuff with the paralysis and the people, and so we get home. And Blake finally gets home from the hospital, and he had to be re-hospitalized one time with an infection, a urinary tract infection. Then he came home a couple days later, but while he was in, they had moved him over to the therapy portion of things, the rehabilitation portion. And I started thinking, I said, listen, I told Sherry, I said, what better way for rehabilitation, occupational therapy than to bring Blake's piano up here? Yeah. And let him play piano and sing and be able to do his Facebook thing. Yeah. And she goes, they'll never allow that. And so the nurse came in. I said, listen, the occupational therapist, the girl in charge, and I told her about it. And I said, that's what he loves to do. And she goes, well, he'd be able to move his foot with that pedal, and he'd be able to. And she goes, I think that'd be a great idea. Yeah. So she went and got permission, and they let me bring his piano up to the room. And so he was up there getting to play piano and sing and everything else. And they let Blake's friend come visit him, his best friend, the friend that hit him. And his friend was just devastated because he thought, he thought that he had done something. Yeah. Then they let my brothers, his uncles come in from Arizona. They let them go up and visit.
That's pretty incredible, because that just wasn't happening everywhere.
It wasn't happening at all.
Yeah.
And it was the exact same hospital that my staff member was at, and they wouldn't let her in. Yeah. So anyway, after we had got home, we were at home and we got our therapist and everything. We're working with our therapist, and once some time went by, but we're working with the therapist, and Blake, just before Christmas, as a week before Christmas, got up and started walking with a walker.
That's what
And
the guy prophesied.
that's exactly what
That's
the
it.
guy prophesied.
Yeah, yeah.
And God had used the song Hallelujah to give confirmation, because how could someone in Pakistan and someone in Tennessee just come up with that same song and them say, Chris, this song is specifically for you, Blake and Sherry.
Yeah,
And it's the same song after the man gave us the prophecy.
Yeah.
So we had no qualms whatsoever. There was no shaken faith whatsoever. I said, Blake is going to walk. I know he's going to walk.
Yeah.
He's going to walk. And so we're at the house and everything, and but there was a lot of things that happened during this process. But I'm going to just skip on to more current stuff. But we're there with Dave, that's the therapist, one day, and Sherry, and with everything, Blake had lost control of his bowels and his bladder and everything, and they were afraid they were going to have to give him a bag, and they were going to have to put catheter and all that, because it just wasn't happening. But they sent him home and gave us time to try to work with him and see what happened. So Dave, his therapist, came in, and Sherry looked down and noticed that Blake had had an accident, went over and whispered in Dave's ear and said, let me go clean him up real quick, and you and Chris talk for a minute while I do this. And so Sherry took him back into the bedroom, and God laid it on my heart to talk to Dave. And I said, man, he said, your son's something else. He said, your family is just something else. I said, well, man, I said, it's been a lot. He goes, yeah? And I said, yeah. So I started telling him for that 10 minutes that Sherry was gone. I actually told him a lot of this story in 10 minutes about this had happened, this had happened, this had happened. And he's just sitting there going,
yeah.
And he's like, his mouth is just open. And I told him, and then he finally looks at me, he goes, that boy has been through all of that, and he still has this kind of an attitude.
Yeah.
And I said, absolutely. And I told him what was prophesied. I said somebody told us from Pakistan, they were praying, they said that Blake's going to walk by Christmas. He goes, well, man, that's a tall order. He said, but we're going to work at it. So he looks at me, and Sherry comes back into the room with Blake and said, Dave goes ahead and does the therapy and stuff. Well, at the end of the therapy, Dave's packing up his bag and everything, and he goes, Blake, I come here to give you therapy. And he said, and I come here and I get therapy every time I walk into this house. Wow. He said, little does your dad know. He said, with a conversation that we had just a little bit ago, he said, last night, he said, I've been having some really bad problems with anxiety attacks. And I've been having issues. He said, I've been having problems with breathing. And he said, and just panic attacks. And he said, last night, he said, I woke up with a panic attack. And he said, I couldn't breathe. And he said, and it freaked me out. And I jumped up. And he said, and I got clear up out of bed and walked downstairs and sat down on the couch to get away from my wife just because I was freaking out. And he said, and for the first time I had ever done this, and he said, I had ever said this. He said, but I said, God, if you're real, I need you to show me now. I need you to prove this right now. Show me you're real. Show me you're real. Yeah. He said, then I come here today and your dad tells me your story and everything that your family has gone through and everything that you've been going through and seeing how God has kept you guys. And he said, and God answered my question today.
Yeah.
All the miracles that you have seen and all the miracles that your family has seen with your kids, with your family. Yeah. He said, it is amazing. And he said, and for God to still, for you to still have your faith. Yeah. And he said, God answered my question. And he came back later and said that he had told his wife about it and everything. But little did we know he knew Dan too, Pastor Dan.
Oh, yeah.
And Dan seen him one day on video. But during all this process, Bobby, it's you go through things, and there's times that we sat there, and I was having panic attacks when Blake was in the hospital. I would get to where I'd be breathing. Me and Sherry came home from dinner one night. Well, came to the hospital. I'm sitting in the car, and I got to where I couldn't breathe, and I just started crying uncontrollably, and I couldn't breathe, and I just started saying, God, why? God, yeah. Why? God, why? Yeah. Why? And I got upstairs, and my phone rang, and it was Ronnie Henson, and he said, and I started telling him because I needed to talk to someone at the time, and Ronnie said, Chris, he goes, man, what do you think we do? what do you think we do whenever we're scared? He said, when you're a kid, he said, you're scared and in the dark. What would you do? He said, you'd cry out for your mom and daddy because you knew they'd fix it, right? I said, yeah. And he goes, you're doing the same thing. You're calling on God and you're saying, God, why? He said, but when you're saying, God, why? He said, you're not questioning God's intentions. He said, you're questioning God, why? And that, you know what that is? That's a question. That's a question. You're asking God. And he said, now we're anticipating an answer. And man, light bulb clicked onto my head. And I'm like, man, that's brilliant. I mean, figure coming from Ronnie.
Yeah.
And, he goes, man, you're just asking God a question and you're anticipating an answer. You've asked him the question. Now just wait and wait for the answer.
Yeah.
So the next day I talked to my brother, Kevin, and I told him what had gone on and stuff and and I said, God, why? And he said, Chris, what's wrong with asking God why?
Yeah.
I go, what do you mean? He goes, we've been taught all of our life. He said, we don't ask God why. You don't question God. He said, but who do we pattern our life? Who are we supposed to pattern our life after? I said, Christ. And he goes, when he was on the cross, what was the biggest question that was ever asked?
Exactly.
Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Why? Why hast thou forsaken me?
That's true.
He said, if we're supposed to be Christ-like, when God's watching his son die on a cross, don't you think that he understands when you're going through this with your son that you're saying, God, why?
Yeah.
He said, don't you think? He said, he came down in human form to know what we go through. And if you think that you don't understand what you're going through, and he said, but don't feel guilty for saying, God, why? He said, because you're asking, and it's the same thing, Ronnie. He said, same thing, Ronnie said, you're asking a question.
Right.
You're saying, God, why? And now he said, no, and Ronnie's right. Now we're waiting on an answer. Yeah. And we're seeing the answers come into fruition now, where Blake's coming to church this last Sunday and walking down the aisle. Yeah, and
didn't someone tell you that prophesied too that he would be at church by Easter?
Yes, they said that what he said, it was the same man. It was Alexander,
same guy. Okay.
And he said, Chris, he said, Blake will walk into church by Passover. Blake will walk in, or by Easter. He said, Blake will walk into church by Easter. He said, I can see him standing and worshiping at the church and singing. I can see him with his hands raised and singing.
Yep.
But now he's told me, he said, he said, Blake is going to walk, and I can see Blake standing on the stage, and I can see him singing with a worship team. Wow. I can see him standing on the stage singing with people on a stage. Uh-huh. And little did he know, that's what Dan promised him. Pastor Dan told him, Blake, when you're able to do this, when we were in the hospital and he's saying, I'll fly away with him and stuff, he said, when you can and you can walk into that church and we can get you on that stage, he said, I'm going to get you on the stage and you're going to sing. Do you got it? And Blake said, absolutely, I got it. And so here we are. And it's just amazing. You know, when you're going through this times, man, and God, why just really becomes so relevant and real whenever you start living it and you learn it the way that we did through this process. Yeah. Because no longer when I'm saying, God, why am I feeling guilty about doing it?
Asking.
And because
I've heard that too, like you said, don't you ever question God. But I've never realized what his own son did,
right,
on the cross.
Right.
I never put that together. That it's okay.
Right.
It's okay to question God.
And it hit me like a ton of bricks. Yeah. And it was just, and it changed me. It changed a lot of things in my psyche, in my spirit and deep down inside in my psyche and everything. And just really changed everything about my outlook and my understanding. I want to share one quick last thing, and talking about knowing something's real, Bobby. And I don't know that I've shared this with you or not. I may have. Blake went in for his second surgery, and we were sitting in his hospital room, and he said, Dad? I said, yeah. And he goes, that last surgery I was in? I said, yeah. And he goes, it happened again. I go, what do you mean it happened again? He goes, I went back to heaven. And I go, you went back to heaven? And I said, was anything different this time? He said, oh, I saw everybody again. I walked in, and Heath and Brandon, and they kept all asking me, do you get to stay this time? Do you get to stay this time? And I said, what did you say, son? He said, I told him, I don't know. We'll have to see what Jesus says. Mm-hmm. And me and Sherry started giggling. And I said, did you see anything different this time? He goes, actually, I did. And I go, what? He said, when I walked into the gates, I saw Bud Chambers standing there. And me and Sherry looked at each other and said, Bud Chambers? Why would the name come up Bud Chambers? Why Bud Chambers? Yeah. We knew Bud years ago, and Danny, his son, had been our pastor at Oasis. Yeah. And it's like, but Blake and Danny were very close, and Blake would go and spend like 2 weeks at a time at their house. And I'd drop Blake over there, and Danny told me one time we sat down and talked, and he goes, man, me and Blake, we've got a special connection, man. We got a special connection. Mm-hmm. And so he said, I saw Bud Chambers, and he was standing at the gate. Anyway, he said, I was with everyone, and all at once we heard a noise at the gate. And they said, Blake, you have to go back. You can't stay. And he said, Dad, he said, what had happened, I didn't finish the last time, but I'll tell you now because it'll go along with this. He went back to the gate, and Jesus said, Blake, I told you when you were here before. He said, I've started a work in you. And he said, you have to go back to earth and you have to finish it. You have to finish the work that I've started. Wow. And and that's what Jesus had said to him the last time that he was there. He said, Blake, I've started a work in you. You have to go back and finish this work. Yeah. But Bud Chambers, and it's like, why Bud Chambers? 2 days later, I had just gotten news that Blake had gone to the bathroom by himself. He had made it happen. Yeah. The nurse told us, and we were just thrilled. And she was like screaming, jumping up and down. Yeah. At the same time, I'm getting a call on my other ear, and it's my sister, Cindy, and it was giving me the word that Danny Chambers passed away. Yeah. And me and Sherry looked at each other, and our mouths just dropped open because Bud Chambers was standing at the gates of heaven waiting for his son. Yeah. And wow. I'm getting chills again right now just talking about this because if I had any question before whatsoever, I mean, him telling the story the way that he did, using a word in a context, in a sentence that he no idea what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. He talked about two people he had never seen, but now he had seen Bud Chambers. Yeah. And then Danny died 2 days later. That's just too much coincidence. No. And it's just, and I don't know if God took him there physically, took his soul there, or gave him a dream, gave him a vision, but I know that God did something.
Yeah, definitely.
And God is doing something. And God is just ever so present, ever so real. And it's changed the way that we look at everything right now. After a while, you become so desensitized after going through so much. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you can relate to this with the stuff your family's been through with Grace. Yeah. Because you have your emotional roller coaster all the time. Mm-hmm. And I dread holidays right now. I mean, I've dreaded holidays for years, getting around Christmas time, because I always had kids in the hospital. Yeah. It was always seemed around the holidays. Yeah. And so every year it'd come around to the holidays. I'm like, I don't want the holidays. I don't want the holidays.
All those memories.
Yeah, and all those memories right back. And now it's different. We get to the holidays, and I'm looking forward to family time, and I'm looking forward, and I just know, I think it was Paul that said to, this life is but a vapor. We appear for a little while, and then we're gone. Right. And it's so true. We're here on earth, and we're here to run our course and to finish the race. And we're here, and while we're here, you have to learn to let go of the things that you can't control. There's the serenity prayer that says, God, help me to accept the things that I can't change. Right. And it's brought a whole new light to all this stuff, is just trust in God.
Yeah. I told you folks that he's been through a lot, and to see the faith in this man that I'm sitting across the table from is just, he's incredible. And he can only be that way because of the Lord. Amen. I mean, if he didn't have the Lord, where do you think he'd be today?
Amen.
There's no telling.
That's for sure.
Probably in a ditch somewhere.
That's
with a bottle in your hand.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's where I would be. And
lost and undone, as they say.
Amen.
But there may be somebody out there that listening to this. Maybe you've gone through similar things in your life, and you don't know where to turn, or you've asked God that same question. God, why? What would you say to somebody like that, Chris?
when you're going through it, when everything seems hopeless and everything seems like it just can't happen, you just got to keep praying. You got to keep the faith. You got to trust. You have to know that we have an author and finisher of our faith. He is there to keep that, everything that we've committed to him. It's all in his hands, and I don't want it to be in my hands, and neither should anyone else. You got to realize when it's out of your hands, it's still in the best hands it can ever be in.
That's for sure.
And that's what we have to focus on. But I would say, when you're going through things and you say why, don't feel bad about saying why, because you're asking God a question.
That's right.
You're saying, God, why? And you're waiting for your answer from your Heavenly Father. You're waiting for him to say, this is why.
Yeah.
Because you went through this, because I perfected you for your next work.
Right.
I perfected you for your next portion of life. Had I not gone through this, I wouldn't know how to do some of the next things I'm probably going to go through.
Yeah.
God uses adversity in our life and trials in our life to show us what the mountains are.
If we could see into the future, we would never ask why,
That's the truth.
because we would know this is why that happened, because of this.
Absolutely.
You know.